debate further the long-term societal and organizational risks that generative AI presents. And in the security and assurance community, with that robust control framework, could this be technology that's good for society? With this, I have the pleasure to introduce our panel here tonight. From the end, Steve Sands. Steve is the current chair of the BCS IRMA and has a specific interests in the security elements of generative AI through his work at Synectics. Welcome, Steve. Thank you. Rob Wilson is also joining us here from the IRMA and represents how organizational risks affect the larger industries, such as his own role at the BT Group. Welcome, Rob. A little bit of a surprise, we have a special guest who wasn't originally on our bill today, but I'm extremely pleased to be joining us representing the FTAG Group, the BCS Technical Advisory Group of BCS Fellows, Professor James Davenport. James is the Hebron and Medlock Professor of Information Technology from the University of Bath, a National Teaching Fellow 2014, former Fulbright Cybersecurity Scholar from New York University, and is the former Vice President and Academy Chair of the BCS. Welcome, James. And finally, we have Jude Ene, who is joining us from the BCS London branch, where he is the current AI Initiatives Lead. Welcome, Jude. Please, can we show our quick appreciation for our esteemed panel tonight? Before we move on to the first point of debate, there's a few housekeeping issues. There is no fire practice here tonight, so if the fire alarm does sound, out the door, turn right, and basically out where you came in. If you do need the loos are basically where the fire escape is actually. Instead of going out, you actually turn right, and they're basically behind us. And phones, preferably can we have them on silent or super silent, please. As well as our event tonight, Harry Styles is at Wembley Stadium on the 13th of June. So I've already been disrupted by Harry Styles fans on the train over. So watermelon sugar on a ringtone won't be appreciated tonight. Thank you. The most important thing tonight is about questions. Each point of debate will be addressed by the panel, and after which we will take the opportunity for a question out here. We do have questions, folks, if you want to raise those online. And we're extremely grateful to Juliet Flavel from the IRMA BCS committee, who's facilitating those questions for us online. And the opportunity for those questions for the people that are online will be facilitated for you by Julia. But after each debate point today, we will be able to take one question from here. But the important thing is, of course, is that we're hanging around afterwards for the networking. So do feel free to grab us after the end. The important thing is tonight, folks, this is being recorded tonight. So the session, the chat logs and everything will be available afterwards. The responses to all the questions will be posted online as well. So let's be clear on the scope. This is about generative AI, not what the Daily Mail call AI. If anyone wants access incidentally to that diagram, I know it's very, very difficult. It's on GitHub. Let me know afterwards. It's very good, the evolutionary tree of AI. And with that, folks, I think it's time that we moved on to our first point of debate. And that is over the risks over the governance. So questions have been raised over the governance within generative AI, and particularly the organizations that own those models. So I would ask the panel, do we have concerns around the wider ethics and culture of these organizations being the custodians of this data? And the second point here is that the GAI models can be trained around perpetual bias against certain communities. So can we cascade the further societal risk? Are there wider implications over human rights? Jude, if we could start with you.
Thank you so much. I think that's one of the burning questions when it comes to artificial intelligence and this version of it. We've always had, at least since the 60s, some notion of artificial intelligence, and it's evolved over time onto this point. And one of the things I like to reiterate is the usability, the accessibility is what has led to this moment, because now anybody can grab this thing and use it and come out with some value. So the question you're asking is, those people that make these things, how should they be good citizens and not allow all sorts of, bad things to be embedded in the models? And you govern them? I think that's a two-edged sword. Some of these organizations are commercial. So you've got the big companies that provide search engines and social media. Others are open source. And these have to, they evolve and co-evolve and they fight between each other. So my point is, how do you govern that? And it's not just in the US or the UK, it's global. So the question is, to make this work for everyone, how can we ensure those are good citizens, they play a good role? And I think it's everyone here giving them feedback and saying, we want this thing to work for us. So I look at it from a consumer point of view. You, the consumer, has the power, and you can apply pressure to these organizations to toe the line, make sure they're doing something that is good ethics involved in that, make sure that it does not play against the rules, and make it easy to target people with it. Because I'm sure my fellow panelists will come into this. There are regulatory means, but I find the most effective is when the users actually say, no, I don't want this. So that's my point.
Okay, thank you. James?
Thanks for asking me. The first point we have to be clear about is it's impossible to train a large language model on unbiased data, because bias is a feature of the application, and a large language model has multiple applications. One example of that was shown to me recently. There's a very good database of all Danish residents, which produces a lot of data, which are unbiased if you're a Danish resident, but it's no use to the rest of the EU because it's totally biased in favor of Danish residents, by definition. And a large language model is trained essentially on the whole of the internet, and therefore it is biased in favor of Fahrenheit rather than Celsius. It's biased in favor, and so on and so forth. And it's biased against the British. It's also biased against the French. It's biased against everyone because it's trained on the whole internet, not these people, and so on. It's impossible to build an unbiased large language model.
Okay, thanks, James. Rob?
I would agree with James there, but AI models are probably by the information they have available to them, and the source of that information is not being channeled in the way that it should be, then we get the results we're looking for.
Steve?
Thank you. Governance is always a problem, isn't it, for any type of system, new system, particularly IT system. And we sit and we consider ethics and morals and standards. I'm used to, within the cybersecurity space, thinking about standards. And I think there's a general consensus emerging that we need some standardization across the globe, that we can't end up with huge differences in the way our AI is developed and deployed in different regions of the world. Otherwise, that will lead to all sorts of probably unforeseen consequences. But standardization is very, very difficult to do on a global level. We see it in cybersecurity. We've got some global standards like 27 series, so 27001, etc. But then you've got NIST coming out with their standards. You've got all sorts of other competing standards. But as time goes on, you find that they start to come very much together into similar patterns of standards. And when I compare the NIST cybersecurity framework with, for instance, the latest version of 27001, there isn't a massive difference between the two. And I imagine we're going to end up in a similar kind of place with AI. AI is a knowledge sharing system, and coming back to the points already made, it will be as good as the data that we feed into it. And I imagine some of the conversations that we're going to have today are around where that data comes from and how accurate it is, how much we can trust it. So I think good data in, hopefully good output out. Any old computer system, bad data in, bad output. So I think the governance angle will be absolutely critical, and the BCS has some very good and sensible firm views on how governance ought to be thought about. Thank you, Tom.
Lovely. Thanks, Steve. Any questions from the audience on this point? You can just raise your hand. Oh, you don't need a microphone. Everything's picked up for you.
Everything that people said sounds wonderful. Most of the words that we use are very ill-defined. Ethics is ill-defined. Standards for what? Bias? Well, yeah, bias is everywhere. So what? Right? This is kind of so what? If everything is so ill-defined, then there can be no governance. There can be no conclusion to this. We'll just sit and talk about it forever.
I kind of agree with where you're coming from on that, and I think that the definition is probably the starting point for determining some governance and some standards. But the truth is, it's all just too new right now, I think, for anyone to have agreed on what they are. I think the European Union has had a crack at defining what AI stands for. I read through it again this afternoon before coming here, and it still didn't really quite resonate with me. So I think we've got some way to go before we have a common understanding of what AI means, and then can develop standards and governance underpinning it. But I suppose the question was, well, if we haven't got those things defined, what do? Do we hold fire and not launch ChatGPT? Do we wait? The world's not going to wait, I don't think. So standards are always catching up with technology. That's the truth of it.
Yes, I completely agree with the point made. I mean, ethics is a very ill-defined, and it's in the eye of the beholder. But the point is, for example, standard like 42001 on AI management systems says that before deploying a system, the board must agree that this system is in line with the ethical principles of the organization. It doesn't say what those ethical principles are. That's for the organization and for the board of directors, whatever it is. But it does say that you have to check that it is in line. If you can't check that, then you shouldn't be deploying it. But it doesn't say what those ethical principles are, because that's not something the standard can do. Similarly, bias. Actually, you don't want unbiased AI. If you want an unbiased AI, you toss a coin. If you want it to use it, for example, hiring, you won't be biased in favor of good candidates. You want bias. Unbiased AI is useless. What you want to do is have the wanted biases, but not the unwanted biases. And what biases are wanted versus unwanted is, again, a matter for the organization, but they need to be checked. And that's what standards can do, is they can say that these forms must be checked against the goals of the organization, whichever those are. Now, of course, organizations in the UK, certain kinds of bias are illegal, and therefore those need to be checked against. Other kinds of bias may be legal. For example, it's totally legal to be biased against people with white hair, but you wouldn't necessarily want that. So there's legally forbidden biases, and also biases you don't want, even though they may be legal. But those are matters for the organisation to decide that it does or it will or will not accept those biases.
I've got another quick question now. Anything you have?
How would we go about enforcing these standards? Someone can have an open source model running at home on their PC, or they can deploy a few hundred clones on Azure or AWS. And that would be, with current open source models, that's the equivalent of having a team of interns just throwing stuff at the wall until something sticks. How would standards go about enforcing standards on these free radicals?
If I may, that's an interesting challenge, because there's two sides. We look at the large organizations that create the models, and you forget that individuals, citizen developers, can also do the same, and some of them actually catch on. Example being something like was it Midjourney? No, what's it called? Sorry,
The Llama or the Vicuña models?
No, this is more one of those stability diffusion. Right, stable diffusion, and somebody went and created unstable diffusion, because in stable diffusion you had things that made it so that it didn't show things like nudity. Somebody did unstable diffusion and took all the clothes off. This happens, and it's part of the evolution. So my point is, standards are great, but then everybody ignores them. They need to keep evolving as much as the technology does. It'll never catch up. I agree with you completely, Steve. It's one of those things. It's hard to keep pace. It's reactionary almost.
And just to pick up on that point, I think I'm not sure that you want necessarily to have heavy duty regulation over clever people who do better stuff with IT, because that's how the world moves on. You know, and if we think about how IT has developed over the decades, it's by people trying things out in their garages.
Yeah, I suppose that the problem with this particular case is that someone clever may make a mistake and put something on autopilot that causes exponential harm.
Absolutely, you're right. We hope that you will have some check and balancing before it gets deployed into a place where it can do harm.
Doesn't have the kill switch. Isn't it the question of conformity assessment on one side, and maybe on program proof, which is a bit more academic on the other?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
Conformity assessment, you prove that in a certain way, or you demonstrate how your software complies with the requirements of the standards. And if you do that, the classical way to put a product onto the market, a physical product, is to demonstrate conformity assessment.
Okay, I understand.
On the other hand, if you want to prove that your program is doing what it says, it's very difficult. But mathematically, there are some explorations of that.
Yes.
Okay, we'll move on to the next point of debate because we've got a few to get through tonight, and hopefully it's going to cover the end to end. So thank you everyone for your inputs to that. Okay, the second point is a little bit more recent actually. I think it was last week or the week before. The case of a US lawyer who used ChatGPT in the defense of a personal injury case. Got his knuckles wrapped for it, but it did raise questions over the ethics of the use of such generative AI in professional circumstances. The question for the panel is, where do we think we should be drawing these red lines in certain professions or institutions, if at all? Are there cases for not using GAI in professional or academic circumstances? I'm going to go to James first, because I know he's got some very specific views on this.
Thanks. Yes, it's a very interesting story, and there's a very nice follow-up article in the New York Times by a senior software engineer who says, we know people don't read instructions, and this lawyer clearly never read the instructions on ChatGPT, which says, warning may hallucinate. We do listen to stories. More seriously, the point is, for anything that is in EU speak, even medium risk, never mind high risk, it is the case that these models, as they stand currently, cannot be used without genuine, not just human oversight in the large sense, but actually a human agreeing that in these circumstances, this output is something I am prepared as a human being to sign for. And then you get the problem, which is very real, of automation bias, that people will sign off because the computer's generated it. And that is a very real problem, and it's one for which, frankly, we do not have a great solution. There is some work in certain fields. So airline pilots get a lot of training on how and when to override the autopilot. In fact, they get more training on that, they do on how to turn the autopilot on. And we need something like that to deal with the very real problem of automation bias. In my own field as an academic, we've seen this very badly with COVID and the move to online exams and people sitting exams in their own bedroom and so on. There was a great move towards automatic proctoring tools that make sure people weren't cheating and so on. And what these tools did was they flagged up and said, here is behavior that a human being should look at. That's what the tools did. And the human beings, very much by and large, would automatically refer the student concern for cheating. They did not actually look at it. There was one case where a professor ticked off 100 such cases in a minute. Yeah, automation bias. The computer said there was something wrong here, which not what you said. There was something unusual, which is not the same as something wrong. But automation bias is the biggest risk to human oversight, in my view, and we do not have a good solution to that. I believe certain sectors in certain ways, I mentioned airline pilots do, but in general, we do not have a good solution to human oversight, which makes me feel that in the current situation, we have to be very dubious about the use of these things at all in high-risk circumstances, because you cannot guarantee, or even with high probability, that the human oversight will actually be effective.
James, Jude.
I totally agree. I mean, when it comes to the case of the lawyer, it was his fault, literally, because he chose not to look at what he was presenting, and each point he made was actually false, completely hallucinatory. So thankfully, the judge was able to figure that out. Imagine if it had gone on and got accepted, and whoever it was got found guilty or what have you. Then you start to see the consequences that these systems can bring out. So from my point of view, yes, there needs to be a human in the loop, but the human needs to be awake and aware of what his responsibilities are, which is, if this were to happen to me, how would I feel about it? So it's values-based. A lot of this evolutionary aspects of this system comes back to, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a person? What about myself? How do I see these things? And then machines telling you something, you've got to ask that question as well. You can't be automation biased. You've got to guard against that. And I feel that's something we need to teach and get more people aware of, and it becomes part of the training for existing in this new way of being, so to speak.
Thanks, Jude. Rob?
Well, we were looking at automating our sort of security consultancy, and we wouldn't rely on getting information from the internet for it. We want to train students ourselves so that we have our own truth there, and we can be confident that it's going to be the right information.
Good point. Steve?
I was just thinking about something James said, and he was talking about high risk, and of course, the question comes back to, well, what do you mean by high risk? And I think in many cases, sectors are going to have to decide where AI fits within those individual sectors and where it doesn't, where it can do the job, where it can't. Certainly within those high risk sectors and for those high risk decisions, human intervention, the human review of the AI output is difficult. Picking up on Jude's point, yes, the human needs to be awake and savvy, if you like, within the context of what the information that AI is providing to them, because if it just spills out a load of data and you simply copy and paste it, well, it's almost caveat emptor, isn't it? You know, you've gone and bought something or done something and you have no idea what it is that you've done and why. So I think, we almost come back to governance and regulation, and some of that will be global. Some of it, I think, will need to be at a sector level, providing advice and guidance on how and where and when AI can be used appropriately within those scenarios and contexts. I think that's where we'll end up.
And something for the host to add, actually, because myself from the public sector background, would we want something like this to come up with the conclusion about putting a child in care, or coming up with a care plan for your elderly relative with dementia? So yeah, some interesting debates there over those kind of standards and ethics. It was something I raised when I was here last time. They said, but that sort of thing won't happen. Well, those are decisions that are taken in local authorities every day. So something to consider. Okay, well, we've got time for one question from the floor on this one. Yes.
So I was interested in the kind of learning to coexist, if you like, or learning how to use these tools better. And on the point of getting hallucinatory answers, I understand that if you structure your prompt better, for example, with a demonstrably false answer, you can get a better answer. So does this will this ultimately come to better user training, actually, both on what you put in, but also in what you get out? So this is how we need to start to work better with these tools.
I'd go as far as to say there's an onus on you, the user, to know enough about the subject you're asking so that you can discern if it's making sense or not. And maybe there's a future point here where it comes into education. Should you use these tools in certain scenarios or shouldn't you? I don't think you can stop people from using the tools. However, you can make them aware that in order to use it effectively, they've got to be knowledgeable enough to discern when it's bullshitting you. Sorry for the French, because that's what it does. It literally can do that.
And are you kind of suggesting that the lawyer didn't know enough to judge the quality of the output he was given?
Negligence. I feel that was pure negligence.
I think it was as well.
If I just had an example in schools, we had the CAS Computing Schools Network here earlier today, and they were giving examples of having students use ChatGPT to come up with an answer, and then teaching them how to critique them. What's missing? Why is it wrong? How has it not done that? Has it covered these aspects? And actually building that
Like critical thinking skills.
Absolutely key, absolutely key. And kind of being able to go divergent and come back to, so what should we do? And how do we leverage this input to help us move forward? And there were some really good examples of that kind of approach. And then also using the homework and the education kind of tools around the ChatGPT to help complement the work that the student does.
Yeah.
Right. It's just like saying, you know, should we stop people using calculators? You know, mental arithmetic is very important. You should just use, and actually would say, okay, no, the world moving forward, ChatGPT is there. How do we make them better consumers of this to make them more effective and use it to help drive forward?
Almost reacting in the same way as you might do to an opinion. So if you shared an opinion, I might have a critical view of it and consider it from different angles. It's the same sort of approach.
Yeah, and everybody comes with a different domain of expertise and knowledge and experiences. How do you bring those to bear?
It's a more human experience almost.
Exactly.
If I may, you guys are the perfect example of how to use ChatGPT. It's conversational AI. You interact with it, not take everything it gives you wholesale. That was brilliant to see. Sorry.
I read an advert today on the way here. Something has produced an AI model specifically for use within fraud prevention, which is the sector I work in. And it was quite interesting. I haven't been able to validate any of it, but it was describing this, I think it's called Lucy, describing this as a co-pilot for the fraud investigators. And it was suggesting that it reduced a typical investigation from hours down to minutes. And I thought about it, a co-pilot, it doesn't sound like the right term to use. Within an airplane, a co-pilot can take over and run the thing. I see it more of as an assistant, and it's all about, as you guys were saying, making sure that you're asking it the right questions and then interpreting what you get back. And over time, you'll get better at asking the questions so that you get better responses from it.
So Stephen, can I add a point here, which is we are all being driven by the history of science fiction. Right, and we are desperately trying to personify this bit of technology, and that forces us to give it terms like co-pilot, like autopilot, like, you know, assistant. It's just a tool. Right, let's put it back in its box. It's a tool.
But I add to that. I quite agree with the considerations given to human oversight, and also the need for open innovation and letting the system go. However, there are some specific cases, probably in engineering, where you have hierarchical designs proven to work, where you might benefit from modules of AI with human oversight, but at the lower level, interfacing with the world, even in real time, even in critical situation where a human is not fit for purpose, you might trust a system more than a human. Example, your ABS braking system. It's performing better than you, and you trust it because it's been proven. There might be cases where it's not 100% what you want it to be, but it's giving you an additional efficiency which we humans cannot provide. So I wonder if you think that AI system will, in many cases, look like the ABS system.
I think it may well do in many cases, and again, I think it depends to some extent on the context and the data that you put into it. We have strived for decades to build knowledge-based systems that we can use in different areas of industry and for engineering, for electronics, for whatever it is. And AI is simply a knowledge-based system. Now, when you boil it all down, that's what it is. But the knowledge that you get out of it will be based on the knowledge that you put into it in the first place. And we were chatting over coffee just before we came in here and talking about perhaps some of the benefits that the health sector might get from it. So if you go to one hospital and see one consultant, you might get one diagnosis. If you go to a different hospital, see a different consultant, you might get a slightly different diagnosis. One would hope that over time, if all of the best consultants pool their knowledge into an AI system, then you would get a consistent diagnosis for the same set of symptoms every time.
Yeah, Steve, just building on that, if you look at the radiographer and the tools that radiographers have today, analyze a CT scan or analyze images, it's actually a very difficult job. If you look at the performance of a radiographer on a Monday morning, their accuracy level is about 90%. Friday afternoon, that same radiographer will be performing at 50%. Right? The AI tool that they have to augment them means that most of them working at 90%. That's a massive societal value and productivity.
Work all night.
Yeah, but that's a real example, and that's been live for over 5 years now. That's it. That's basically an AI system that's been trained over 10 years to be efficient and effective.
We'll move on to the next debate point, vote that we the opportunity to talk to start with. And I'm afraid, Steve, we're going to stick with Steve on this one. And that's much been said over the potential use of GAI for malicious purposes, but it works both ways as well. So specifically on the security, how can the security and assurance communities utilize generative AI to prevent or predict future attack vectors? And Steve will start with you as well.
Great question. And I think, sadly, I think we'll get into some sort of arms race because the good guys and the bad guys are going to take advantage of AI for the same thing, but for slightly different purposes. So I know, talking to Rob earlier on, don't want to steal his thunder because he's already done some thinking on this. But I think AI is going to generally increase people's awareness of threats and risks to information security systems, to IT systems. I think it will bring massive benefits because it will increase the knowledge of people working in, your typical security operations center, which is staffed with a whole bunch of, if you like, level 1 analysts, smaller number of level 2 analysts, even smaller number of level 3 analysts. As you go up that pyramid, you become more knowledgeable, you become more experienced. And what AI will do will help some of the people at level 1 to learn more quickly. It's not a matter of needing less of them. It's not a matter of de-skilling them. It's a matter of giving them more information. That's a huge benefit. It's almost a democratization of information that people can use to do their job better.
Well, yeah, one of the things that AI will bring in is anomaly detection, being quicker, more effective, better threat detection, automated security responses that can happen quicker than the line 1, line 2 guys can do. And then conceptual knowledge, bridging the gap between human AI that we learn from the AI systems. And then visual analytics can be used to provide visual graphics of a situation, detected, being recognized.
Thanks.
Yes, I mean, we said we don't need fewer cybersecurity analysts. We actually need far more. There's an enormous mismatch between job supply and demand in that area. And if AI can make the level 1 analysts more effective, it's not a case, it's a case not so much of needing fewer of them, it's a case of having more of the desk filled, which is a real problem. And the other point, of course, is the 24/7 question. I was recently incident commander for a cybersecurity incident, and the first question I asked the team is, are we doing this 9 to 5 or 24/7? Because that greatly affects your staffing profile, therefore affects everything you can do downstream. And more 24/7 level 1 automation will greatly improve things. If I was a cybersecurity analyst, I would not be fearing for my job. If I from AI at all, if I was a radiographer, I might be slightly more worried. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think for this particular use case, your I guess cybersecurity requirements should include the need for things, the equivalent of ethical hacking. So your job description is not only preventing, but actually predicting, trying to find out what the next vector is and actually coming up with it yourself. You do hackathons and get people to try and break your systems and learn from that. I think that's probably the job of a cybersecurity expert, find out what the threats, likely threats could be using generative AI. Why not? The other guys will use it anyway. So that's my.
Thank you. And actually, I have a quick point from the point that was made earlier about training people in the proper script writing. Steve, do you see that as a potential skill for people coming on for that kind of script writing enable people to predict and prevent these vectors?
Well, hugely, I think people will need to be educated how to get the best out of these tools. Coming back to the point Rashid was making, it's a bunch of tools. It's another bunch of tools that these people have got in their armories, and like any other tool, you need to be trained or taught how to use it well, get the best out of it.
Questions from the floor? We have no one that's concerned about security here.
All sorted.
Quick one, yeah.
Well, I mean, I was thinking about what you were saying, and if you look at it from exactly the other side, the problem is that it's much easier, and there are many, many, many more people who are doing it on the attack side and using these tools. It's, it doesn't matter to them if they get it wrong 1,000 times. And it doesn't matter to them if they get the chat conversation and the instructions wrong 1,000 times. They only have to hit once.
You're right, and of course there are so many different aspects to doing information security well. The analogy I often come up with is, you've got a football field with 2 teams of 11 players, except with in this game you don't. You have one team, the defenders, who've got 11 players. They think they're playing with one football. They're playing to rules and they're playing within the pitch. But of course, the other team have got as many footballs as they want, and they can play wherever they want with as many players as they like. And as you rightly say, you've only got to get one ball in the goal, and you've got a big problem. But in the grand scheme of things, we do pretty well because we've got all of these different layers of security. Yes, we keep having security breaches, but just put that into context about how many systems and how much data there is actually out there. And it's like any other industry where you've got attackers and defenders, it's like burglaries or anything else. So you do your best to prevent them, you risk assess, and you build up your defenses according to the risk of the particular problem, the crown jewels that you detect. So you're right to some extent, but I think AI will inevitably have a huge influence on the capabilities of the people trying to defend. But there is an arms race going on, so we are going to end up in a situation where the bad guys are developing these tools to attack the systems. The good guys are using similar tools to try and defend. We all have a slightly different view of the same system.
Questions online?
Yeah, quickly. Yeah.
Sorry, you might have questions online.
They're being dealt with at the end. So, sorry.
Yeah, so it's good. No, it's good.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, right, we're going to move on then to the next debate point, and we kind of started discussing this earlier, so I think there's max time for this. So international compliance frameworks around wider AI already exist, such as ISO 23053-22, which even myself up to 2 weeks ago I didn't even realize existed, and the AI framework provided by NIST. I'd ask the panel, is the risk greater in using these frameworks as a basis for one size fits all, or discarding them totally and then spending extra time creating the additional regulation from scratch? And I think we discussed before, is this very much linked with the assurance that we can gather potentially from the current EU initiatives. Jude, can I start with you on that one?
You're going to start with Rob.
No.
I'll go. I think those regulations are a good starting point, right? And I don't believe there's a one size fits all. I think, you know, the way organizations will use things like that will be, that's the baseline. Then they'll need to customize it to fit their industry or their. There's not going to be one answer that tells you is how we regulate these things. The EU initiative is a guideline, but for organizations, take it in, use it as a baseline, and then extrapolate to meet your needs. I feel that's probably what's going to come out from here.
Okay, that's great. James?
I should declare my hand here. I'm actually liaison officer between ISO Committee 42, which is the international AI body, and Sensenelec JC21, which is the European AI standardization body. So my hands are very dirty. What we'd like to see is international standards as far as possible, because AI and the internet and everything else are global. There are some aspects where European standardization or indeed national standardization will have to take front seat. But the point is, standardization and regulation work hand in hand. So, for example, there's a law in the UK that says you have to wear seatbelts, and there are standards that say what those seatbelts must be. And you cannot sell a car if the seatbelts do not match the standards. That's an example of the interplay between laws, the hard end of regulation, and standards. I can build a bridge over the river in my back garden. I don't have to follow any of the standards on bridge building at all. But if I want to allow people to cross it, then and it falls down, I might be guilty of negligence. If I want to have a business that lets people cross it, I'm going to require insurance. My insurance company is going to ask, was it built to the standard? We're going to ask, was it built by a chartered bridge engineer, and so on. And I think we have underplayed the role of insurance. We're seeing this in the cybersecurity market very much, as people cannot get cybersecurity insurance without following certain standards and certain best practice. I think we will see insurance and certain forms of regulation underpinned by standards, as in the seatbelt example, will play a very powerful part. But I said I can build a bridge in my back garden, and no one says I have to use bridge building standards. And we can play with AI in our own equivalent of back gardens and so on. It's when we start selling a product or making a product that we have to start looking at what the regulations are and what standards underpin them.
Thanks.
Well, we are a global economy, so international standards will be useful in going ahead. That will come in time when we agree on them.
Thank you, Steve.
They take ages, don't they, standards to be formulated, and I mean, we're talking about a good couple of years until the European Union have finished with their AI Act, and an awful lot's going to happen in the next 2 years with generative AI. My own view is that we'll probably end up with a bit of a mix of standards and regulation across the piece, both globally and across different parts of the world. But also, I think the thing to perhaps also consider is that there has to be some context in the use of that particular AI for that particular sector of what you're going to use it for will to some extent depend on how rigorously those standards need to be applied. Well, in some use cases, That GPT used by the kids in school to look up how to write a pop song. Does it matter that much? But if you're using it in a health context, very different set of standards need to be applied to it. So I think the usage and the context of the AI will determine the level of standards that we need to apply to it, like almost anything else that we do.
Thanks, Steve. Any questions from the floor on this? Yes, please.
Thanks. Specifically to James, you were mentioning insurance, and I'm just really curious what you'd expect a world in which insurance and AI to sort of collide. What would that look like, and what would these claims maybe even look like? It feels quite foreign to me. And also, how would you reconcile that with the fact that, as we mentioned earlier, a tool is only as good as the person using it? And if we're expecting or anticipating everyone to be effective users of the tools, or more realistically, people are going to be putting in a lot of nonsense, how do we incorporate that into insurance?
So I would expect in maturity, so I look at cybersecurity as an example which is a bit ahead. If you look, an example that's a long way ahead is bridge building, where, for example, the bridge has to be built and signed off by a chartered structural engineer. We're nowhere there in IT yet, and I think maybe we should be. That's another debate, as it were. But I would see that, yeah, if you're selling a product and you want product liability insurance, that insurer should be asking questions like, well, who built that product? What was the quality assurance process, and so on. I think insurance is not there yet. They're still groping around in cybersecurity. But they are starting. Over the last 5 years, we've seen in cybersecurity a big change in the way insurers approach it, and they are now asking for certain minimum standards and so on. And I think we will see that simply because, you know, boards of directors like to have insurance. You have to follow the money in one sense, or follow the risk. And people will take risks from time to time, but yeah, if you drive a car which you can't get insurance for, then you have a problem. And people make mistakes. People do that sort of thing. But nevertheless, insurance is a very powerful weapon. And I think its power is underestimated. And I say cybersecurity is a good example. But I say also all sorts of things, like my bridge example again. Yeah.
Could I just follow up briefly on that one, and thinking back about the example you had before with the wonderful lawyer who, okay, fine. He wrote his name on the bottom of it, actually wrote his name on the top of the document before he sent it in. So he was taking professional responsibility for it. He'll suffer for that. But he was using ChatGPT, and I haven't read his deposition that he put in his defense, but I'm pretty certain that somewhere in that he will have blamed OpenAI for his mistake. But OpenAI, I think, claim that they're not actually providing or selling a product. And also they're covered by Section 230, and they're covered by the American policies and principles and things like this, and it's contract law in there. It's a license that you're given, it's not a sale, it's a license, and. So in the end, he's probably claiming that nobody is responsible.
Actually, that's not true. He's saying I made a mistake. That's I've read his.
You read it in detail.
I've read both.
Bothered.
Yeah, I have. He's admitted he made a mistake. His quote defense is he thought it was consulting legal databases.
Okay.
But yeah, it wasn't. And yeah, ChatGPT's own disclaimer says that. So it is quite clearly his professional negligence. But as I said, but people don't read warnings.
Yeah.
And this is a major problem.
But the same thing comes back in things like self-driving cars, where I'm pretty certain that, you know, the license on a self-driving car says that you're on your own. And basically that woman who killed a person pushing a bicycle in the rain, in the dark, actually in twilight, the car owners are not being sued. The people who built and manufactured the car are not being sued. She's the only person being sued. And yet she is the person with the least power and the least money and the least everything. And also, in some ways, the most direct control, but in many ways, actually the least control also.
And there's another case in the US where someone attached weights to his steering wheel so that the Tesla autopilot thought he had his hands on it.
Oh, wow.
Yes, and alas, very seriously injured, fortunately killed, very seriously injured, a teenager, committed all sorts of crimes like driving past a stopped school bus, which is illegal in that state and most states, and so on. But at that point, there's clear. I would argue criminal, but I'm not a US law expert. Negligence on that person's part.
But this comes back to this point about insurance.
Yeah.
In that insurers do like clarity over responsibility, over liability, over all of this stuff, and there is no clarity.
Stage, there really isn't. Again, that's one of these. That I work. We've got all sorts of people who got excited and wanted to start using it. And myself and the guy who's our CISO sat down and said, what do we do here? Do we just let people use it, or do we put some blocks on at the proxies and stop them getting to it on their business accounts, on their corporate accounts? Should we block it? Should we do an Italy job and say, no, you're not using it here? Or should we be sensible and grown up and say, well, actually, it's just another tool? And when we had a look at it and we looked through all of the policies that we have, our security policies, the acceptable use policy and the information security policy and the various other policies that sit within that suite, all defined how you can use ChatGPT safely. So if you're a bid writer, if you're a developer, if you're in anything really, the rules are all there for good, sensible use of internet resources. And we determined that ChatGPT was another slightly more advanced internet resource. And as such, we'd send a little reminder out to everybody to say so. This thing here, it's relatively new. Be careful how you use it. Remember, you're bound by confidentiality. Remember, you can't share PII with it that you wouldn't put anywhere else on the internet. Remember that you can't put any of our code into it that you wouldn't want appearing on the World Wide Web. Blah, blah, blah. Job done. And as far as I'm aware, everybody's using it very sensibly and value from it. So I think onward and upward.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, we're going to make one more attempt. Juliet, can you hear us?
Hello. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We thought you were disrupted by a generative AI model there.
Well, yes, we were disrupted by something, but we're back.
Juliet, can you give us some questions that of the general theme of the stuff that's been coming online, and we'll get the panel to answer those, please.
Yeah, sure. So going back to basics, we had some chat about actually what a definition of AI is, and if the panel could define it for us, please. And we heard other things like knowledge-based systems, machine learning, robotic tools, and coded human intelligence. And so could we have your definition of AI, please?
Just to say to the panel members, no pressure.
Thank you. Thanks, Julie. That's a really good question because, like I said at the start, AI has been around since the 60s at least. One of the things with it is it's kind of like an onion. It just keeps growing layers on top of itself. So artificial intelligence is a family of technologies. It's not one thing. And within that family of technologies, there are various techniques. In fact, they fall into 3 or 4 categories. One is natural language processing, NLP, which processes the understanding in terms of language. That's used in large language models. One is about robotics, being able to control systems with artificial intelligence. Another one is about good Lord, machine learning, they call it. But that is a way of implementing systems so that the machines can learn and they use supervised or unsupervised. Then there's a wrapper around that, actually a subset of that called deep learning, which is a more model-based ability to take data and come up with, there's so many different things, but as you peel the layers, you come down to something like generative AI. There's computer vision, sorry, there's another one is vision and audio. But the heart of it is each of these layers or each of these outposts or outgrowths of AI can, like generative AI, become, ubiquitous. And so when we say generative AI, it's actually one small part of deep learning using language models that is used to create what we're seeing as a phenomenon now. But each of the other spaces could also eventually become something interesting. I'll bore you. I did my master's in University College London, and I had a project on email classification using, at the time it was evolutionary programming, using genetic programming techniques, which is very arcane to think about it, but when you think about it, the population of programs that you then have crossbreeding and come up with the best one is the model you use. It's the same theme that applies even to what we're calling generative AI. So the models learn as you use them, the prompts you give them helps them learn and get better, which is why I feel this is only going to accelerate and get faster. And so all the concerns we have here multiplied by 10 by the time you get to 2-3 years, but also the benefits multiplied by 20, it's going to be a bit of both, and we have to get ready for the ride. Sorry, long speech, but that's my answer.
Any other members of the panel want to add on to that?
I'll have a stab at saying something slightly different. There are two possible families of definitions of AI. One's a technology-driven one, so my colleague has given a very good example of that. The other one is, as it were, the outside definition, and the EU AI Act, I don't have precise words in my memory, but basically it is the use of automated processing to make decisions. And it doesn't care how that automated processing is working. So my analogy, again, I'll go back and say that in the UK, we have a Motor Vehicles Act. We don't have an Internal Combustion Engines Act. We don't have an Electric Vehicles Act. We don't have a Hybrid Vehicles Act. We have a Motor Vehicles Act. Anything motorized that drives on the public road. And in some sense, the question that the EU has made many mistakes, in my view, in its AI regulation, but the overall one of saying that we will judge it by its effects rather than its technology is a correct decision. So I think we as society, we're not interested in technology, we're interested in the effect.
Okay. Robin, Steve, anything to add?
No, I was going to say what they said.
Julia, is there very, very quickly, is there any other themes that are coming out from the online questions?
We've got the theme of the standards. Will the frameworks have any teeth, or will a domain be regulated in practice by intellectual property disputes? And also a question about how are we going to conformance test these systems that are designed to learn?
Take on auditors like me. Who wants to lead on that one?
Well, I'll say the conformance testing is $64,000 question, both in the standardization bodies themselves and more widely. And frankly, conformance testing of AI systems that learn on the fly is an unsolved problem. We saw that back in 2015 when Microsoft deployed their Tay chatbot, which had to be pulled out because it rapidly learns offensive and discriminatory behavior. We've seen the same mistake, I can't remember the exact details, 2 weeks ago. And I frankly believe we are not, technologically, we do not know how to do conformance testing of dynamically learning systems with today's technology. I'm not saying that won't happen. I'm saying today's technology does not permit that, which is an interesting one. And that therefore means that it therefore puts a big barrier in the use of those systems in certain circumstances. performance testing is a real hard challenge. I mean, it's hard enough in cybersecurity. Thanks.
Okay, right, folks, I'm afraid we will need to wrap up because we've already gotten 10 minutes over. We could probably talk for another 3 hours, but I think the staff want to go home. The time is up for tonight, folks, but as we know, the debate is going to continue, and hopefully what our panel's outputs and the discussions here today have shown that now is the right time for all of you to be debating amongst your professional academic communities in raising your hands and raising your voices so that we can all work together to make GAI good for society now and in the future. The fact remains, even for myself personally, that as a BCS member, I've never seen us come together united on such an issue such as this, with one voice on one particular matter. And I think this can only enhance and endorse the BCS as a trusted advisor for government and industry going forward. In fact, you can all help right now. The BCS, as I said earlier, is looking for signatories against that open letter to government and industry over the shared standards in technical and ethical practice for AI. I was hoping that that link was going to be up there, but it's been disrupted. So what I will do is I'll put the link on my pad and please come over, take a picture of it, whatever you need to do. And also what's really important about that open letter is the phrase coded in Britain, which was coined by James himself. So I do believe the letter is open for signatories. I think James killed Friday the 16th.
Friday, yeah.
Friday the 16th. So yes, if you want to make a difference, here's your chance. And finally, if you're sat here and you're not a member of the BCS, then why not? As mentioned earlier, now is the time to join this professional institute. It supports, it mentors, it represents, it enhances the technology industry, and each one of us are part of it. And we need more people like you to make IT good for society. www.bcs.org, find out some more. As is usual with the presenter, he does his personal thank yous. So a quick reminder for everyone who did field questions offline, we are taking a download of those, and as a panel we have agreed to respond to all of those, and the responses to those will be uploaded when the recording for this is uploaded as well. A few thank yous from me personally. So thank you to the BCS staff here in London. I know I was a pain popping down last week, making sure everything was working okay, but thank you. Thank you to my BCS IRMA committees, especially to Juliet, who stepped in at the very last minute to facilitate our online attendees. Thank you, Juliet, for that. Thank you to Dallin over there for nominating Jude for coming along. Thanks, Steve, because he's just there, for nominating his colleagues from the IASG. And Adam, I don't know if you're online, you may or not be, but thank you to Adam Leon-Smith, Chair of FTAG, for nominating James to attend this important debate as well. And lastly, thank you from me to you for making this a good event. Before we go, ladies and gentlemen, please give our appreciation to our